At 7:32 a.m. on February 10, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch watched 6 Japanese Zeros diving toward his 4 Wildcats over Wake Island, knowing his pilots had maybe 90 seconds before they died. 37 years old, 214 flight hours in Wildcats, 0 kills against Zeros. The Japanese had sent 18 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters to sweep American patrols from the morning sky. Thatch's Wildcat was slower. The Zero climbed faster, turned tighter, and could outmaneuver any American fighter at any altitude. Japanese pilots knew it. American pilots knew it. The math was simple and brutal. A Zero could outturn a Wildcat in 14 seconds. 14 seconds to get on your tail, 14 seconds to line up guns, 14 seconds to kill you. By February, the Pacific Fleet had lost 43 Wildcats in 1-versus-1 dogfights with Zeros, 43 pilots who tried to turn with Zeros, 43 funerals. The pattern never changed. American pilot sees Zero, American pilot turns to engage, Zero outturns him, Zero shoots him down. Command kept sending the same orders: avoid turning engagements, run if possible. But running meant abandoning other pilots. Running meant letting Zero strafe your buddies while you fled. Thatch commanded Fighting Squadron 3, 4 pilots, 4 Wildcats, 4 men who trusted him to keep them alive. But he had no answer for the Zero's turn radius, no answer for its climb rate, no answer except watch good men die. 3 days earlier, Thatch had sat in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego staring at a pack of matches. His wife had sent them in a care package, 20 wooden matches in a thin cardboard box. He'd been thinking about the Zero problem for weeks. How do you beat an enemy who can outturn you? How do you survive when the enemy is faster, more agile, and flown by pilots with 2 years of combat experience? Thatch picked up 2 matches, held them parallel. Then he moved them in opposite directions, weaving them past each other. The matches crossed, crossed again, never separated, always supporting each other. And something clicked in his brain. What if 2 Wildcats didn't fight independently? What if they flew as a pair, weaving back and forth? If a Zero got on one Wildcat's tail, that Wildcat would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn toward him. They'd cross paths. And the Zero chasing the first Wildcat would fly directly into the second Wildcat's guns. It was insane. It violated every fighter doctrine in the U.S. Navy manual. Fighters fought alone. Pairs stayed together for navigation. But when combat started, you split up and fought 1 versus 1. That was how air combat worked. That was how every pilot had been trained since 1918. But Thatch couldn't stop seeing those matches weaving together. Couldn't stop thinking about 43 dead pilots. If you want to see if Thatch's matchstick weave worked against Zeros, hit that like button right now. And subscribe, because what happens next is insane. Back to Thatch. He'd called his wingman, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, into his quarters that night, showed him the matches, explained the weave. O'Hare stared at the matches for 30 seconds. Then he looked at Thatch and asked one question. When do we test it? 4 days later, Thatch was about to find out if his matchstick trick would save lives or get 4 pilots killed. The 6 Zeros were 1,200 yards out and closing fast. His hand moved to the radio. Time to try something that had never been done in combat. Time to find out if 2 matches could beat 6 Zeros. Thatch's voice cracked across the radio. Weave on my mark! His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, was 800 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats, piloted by Ensigns Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Colson, flew another 1,000 feet beyond Bassett. 4 American fighters in a loose line, 6 Zeros diving from 11,000 feet. Standard doctrine said split up, turn independently, fight alone. But Thatch keyed his radio and gave an order that had never been spoken in U.S. Navy combat. Bassett, on me. Weave pattern. Execute. Bassett turned his Wildcat toward Thatch. Thatch turned toward Bassett. They flew directly at each other. The Zeros dropped to 8,000 feet. Japanese pilots probably thought the Americans were panicking. Probably thought 2 Wildcats were about to collide. But Thatch and Bassett didn't collide. At 400 yards, both pilots banked hard. Thatch pulled left. Bassett pulled right. They crossed paths with 200 feet separation. Then they kept turning, coming around to cross again, a figure-8 pattern. Two aircraft weaving back and forth like those matches on Thatch's desk. The lead Zero pilot picked Bassett, committed to the tail chase, closed to 600 yards. Standard Zero tactic. Get close, use superior maneuverability, hammer the target with 20mm cannon fire. The Zero pilot probably expected Bassett to try turning with him, probably expected an easy kill. But Bassett didn't turn away from the Zero. He turned toward Thatch. The Zero followed, lining up guns. 500 yards. 400 yards. The Zero pilot had Bassett centered in his gun sight, 3 seconds from firing. Then Thatch's Wildcat came screaming through the weave pattern from the opposite direction. The Zero pilot suddenly had a new problem. He was chasing Bassett, but Bassett was flying directly toward another Wildcat, and that Wildcat had guns pointed straight at him. Thatch opened fire at 300 yards. 650 caliber machine guns, 70 rounds per second. The Zero pilot had one choice: break off the attack or fly into a wall of bullets. He broke off, pulled hard right, climbed. The other 5 Zeros scattered. For the first time in Pacific combat, Zeros were running from Wildcats. Sheedy and Coulson had watched the weave work. Now they tried it. Sheedy turned toward Coulson. Coulson turned toward Sheedy. 2 more Wildcats weaving. Another Zero committed to Coulson's tail. Got to 400 yards. Then Sheedy came through the weave and the Zero pilot flinched, pulled up, disengaged. The dogfight lasted 6 minutes. 6 Japanese Zeros versus 4 American Wildcats. Standard outcome should have been 4 dead Americans. But when the Zeros finally climbed away and headed northwest, all 4 Wildcats were still flying. Thatch checked his fuel, checked his wingman. Nobody hit. Nobody killed. The weave had worked. Thatch landed at Ford Island 40 minutes later. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline. From the realization that maybe, just maybe, American pilots didn't have to die every time they met Zeros. But Fighter Command wasn't convinced. Thatch filed his combat report that afternoon, described the weave, explained how it worked, recommended immediate adoption across all fighter squadrons. The response came back 3 days later. Interesting tactic, needs further testing, not approved for widespread use. Thatch stared at that response for a long time. 43 pilots dead in February, and Command wanted more testing. Meanwhile, the Japanese were planning something bigger, something that would test the weave against odds no fighter pilot had ever faced. Because in 68 days, Thatch would be flying over an island called Midway, and he'd be facing 50 Zeros with 8 Wildcats. Between February and June 1942, Thatch trained Fighting Squadron 3 on the weave every single day. Morning flights, afternoon flights, night formations when the moon was bright enough. His pilots flew the pattern until they could execute it blind. Turn toward your wingman, cross, turn back, cross again. Simple in theory, brutal in practice at 300 miles per hour with Zeros shooting at you. The Navy still hadn't officially approved the tactic, but Thatch didn't wait for approval. He taught it to every pilot who would listen, showed them the matches, drew diagrams on blackboards, explained the geometry. If a Zero commits to your tail, you turn into your wingman. The Zero has to choose: follow you into your wingman's guns or break off. Either way, you survive. Some pilots understood immediately. Others thought Thatch was crazy. One squadron commander told him the weave violated basic fighter doctrine. You can't fly toward another aircraft in combat. You'll collide, you'll panic, you'll get both pilots killed. But Thatch kept teaching, because pilots kept dying. By May, the Pacific Fleet had lost 91 Wildcats in combat with Zeros, 91 funerals, 91 letters to families, and Fighter Command still issued the same orders: avoid engagement when possible, run if outnumbered. The orders might as well have said give up and die. Then, naval intelligence intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Codebreakers at Station Hypo and Pearl Harbor decrypted the messages. The Japanese were planning a massive assault on Midway Island. 4 aircraft carriers, 270 aircraft, the largest carrier operation in Japanese naval history. The attack was scheduled for June 4th, 1942. Admiral Chester Nimitz called every available carrier to Pearl Harbor. He had 3, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. The Japanese had 4, plus 2 years of combat experience, plus Zeros that could outfly anything America had. The math was nightmare fuel. American carriers were outnumbered. American pilots were outmatched. And Midway Island had a runway that Japanese bombers would turn into rubble in the first 30 minutes. Fighting Squadron 3 got deployment orders on May 26th. Report to USS Yorktown. Prepare for carrier operations. Thatch read those orders and understood what they meant. His squadron would be flying combat air patrol over Yorktown when the Japanese attacked, protecting the carrier from bombers, fighting Zeros, maybe dying. He gathered his pilots that evening, 7 men, 7 Wildcats, 7 lives depending on a trick with matches that the Navy still hadn't officially approved. Thatch showed them the matches one more time, explained the weave one more time. Then he told them the truth. The Japanese are bringing 50 Zeros to Midway. Maybe more. We'll have 8 Wildcats. Maybe fewer if Enterprise or Hornet lose fighters before the battle. The only way we survive is the weave. The only way we protect Yorktown is the weave. The only way we win is the weave. One pilot asked the obvious question. What if it doesn't work? What if we weave and the Zeros just shoot us anyway? Thatch didn't have a good answer. He just showed them the matches again. Showed them how 2 matches weaving could cover each other, could protect each other, could survive together when surviving alone was impossible. Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 30th. 4 days to Midway. 4 days to prepare for a battle that would decide the Pacific War. 4 days to pray that a matchstick trick would work when 50 Zeros came screaming out of the sky. Because on June 4th, at 0930 hours, Thatch would look up and see something no American pilot had ever faced. A sky completely black with Japanese fighters. June 4th, 1942, 0930 hours. Thatch was at 14,000 feet above Yorktown when the first Japanese strike wave appeared. 18 Aichi dive bombers escorted by 12 Zeros. Not 50. Not the massive formation intelligence had predicted. But 12 Zeros was still 3-to-1 odds against Thatch's 4-plane section. The Zeros came in high, 15,000 feet, standard Japanese doctrine. Establish altitude advantage, dive on American fighters, use speed and maneuverability to dominate the fight. Thatch counted the enemy aircraft, counted his own. 4 Wildcats, 12 Zeros. His hand keyed the radio. Weave pattern. Execute on my mark. His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, was 600 feet to his right, 2 more Wildcats behind them. The Zeros dove. Thatch watched them commit, watched them pick targets. 3 Zeros broke toward Thatch. 4 went after Bassett. The others continued toward Yorktown. Thatch gave the order. Mark, execute. He turned hard toward Bassett. Bassett turned toward him. They crossed paths at 12,000 feet. The 3 Zeros chasing Thatch suddenly had a problem. Their target was flying directly at another Wildcat, and that Wildcat's guns were pointing at them. The lead Zero pilot hesitated, just for 2 seconds, but 2 seconds at combat speed is 400 yards. Thatch came through the weave and opened fire. 50 caliber rounds ripped through the Zero's engine cowling. The Zero rolled left, trailing black smoke, fell away. Thatch's first Zero kill. But the other 2 Zeros didn't break off. They'd seen the weave, understood the pattern, and they adapted. Instead of committing to Thatch's tail, they split. One went high, one went low. They tried to attack from different angles, forced Thatch to choose which threat to counter. Thatch pulled into a climbing turn toward the high Zero. Bassett broke toward the low Zero. The weave pattern fractured. For 6 seconds, both Wildcats were fighting independently, exactly what Thatch had tried to avoid. The high Zero got guns on Thatch at 800 yards. 20mm cannon fire walked up Thatch's left wing. 2 rounds punched through the wing root. One went through his cockpit canopy 3 inches from his head. Thatch felt the shockwave, felt aluminum fragments hit his flight suit, kept turning. Bassett called over the radio. "I'm hit! Repeat, I'm hit!" Thatch looked left. Bassett's Wildcat was trailing white smoke. Coolant leak. Maybe worse. The low Zero was still on his tail, hammering him with machine gun fire. Thatch made a choice. Abandoned his turn toward the high Zero, dove toward Bassett. The weave had broken, but the principle still worked. Get between your wingman and the threat. Thatch came down on the low Zero from 7 o'clock high. 600 yards. 500. 400. He opened fire. The Zero exploded. Pieces of wing and fuselage tumbled through the air. Bassett's Wildcat was shaking, losing altitude. He called over the radio. "Engine's overheating. I'm heading back to Yorktown." Thatch told him go. Told the other 2 Wildcats to escort him. That left Thatch alone at 11,000 feet with 10 Zeros still in the sky. The weave worked with a wingman. Without a wingman, Thatch was just another Wildcat pilot trying not to die. He turned toward Yorktown, started descending. 3 Zeros saw him, turned to intercept. Thatch looked around for friendly fighters, saw 4 Wildcats from another squadron 3 miles east, too far to help. The 3 Zeros were closing. Thatch had no wingman, no weave, no options except run. But running meant leading Zeros toward Yorktown, leading them toward the carrier his squadron was supposed to protect. He keyed his radio, called for help, told the other Wildcats he was engaging 3 Zeros solo, told them if the weave worked, they'd see proof. If it didn't work, tell his wife he loved her. Then Thatch turned his Wildcat toward 3 Zeros and prepared to test whether a matchstick trick could save one pilot's life. Thatch was at 9,000 feet when the 3 Zeros reached firing range. He was alone. No wingman to weave with. No support. But he'd spent 4 months thinking about the weave. 4 months understanding the geometry. And he realized something. The weave didn't require 2 aircraft. It required 2 points in space. He turned hard right, then immediately reversed left. Sharp, angular turns. Not the smooth turning fight Zeros expected. The lead Zero committed to follow Thatch's right turn, but Thatch was already reversing left. The Zero pilot had to correct, had to pull harder, had to burn energy. Thatch did it again. Right turn, left reversal. The Zero followed right, Thatch went left. The Japanese pilot was always half a second behind, always correcting, always reacting. And every correction cost speed, cost energy, cost the altitude advantage. After 40 seconds of reversals, the Zero was co-altitude with Thatch. Same speed, same energy state, no advantage. The Zero pilot broke off, climbed away. The other 2 Zeros followed him. Thatch had just proven something critical. The weave principle worked even without a wingman. Sharp reversals, constant direction changes. Never let the enemy predict your next move. Make them react. Make them bleed energy. Make them quit. He landed on Yorktown 20 minutes later. Bassett was already aboard. His Wildcat had taken 4 hits, but the engine held together long enough to reach the carrier. The other pilots from Fighting Squadron 3 were debriefing in the ready room. They'd all seen Thatch's solo fight. All watched him survive 3 Zeros alone. Word spread through the fighter squadrons that afternoon. Thatch's weave works, even solo, even outnumbered. By evening, pilots from Enterprise and Hornet were asking Thatch to explain the tactic. He showed them the matches, drew diagrams, demonstrated the reversals. Some pilots tested it that night. Pair flights over the carrier groups, practicing the weave, learning the timing. By June 5th, 18 Wildcat pilots could execute the pattern. By June 6th, 32 pilots. The weave was spreading through the fleet faster than any official doctrine ever had. Japanese pilots noticed. Radio intercepts from June 7th included references to new American tactics. American fighters flying in coordinated pairs. American fighters executing unpredictable maneuvers. American fighters that refused to die. One intercepted message from a Japanese fighter commander said, "American Wildcat pilots have changed their methods. Expect increased resistance." On June 10th, Fighting Squadron 3 flew combat air patrol over a convoy near Midway. 8 Wildcats. 14 Zeros attacked. Thatch called the weave. All 4 pairs executed. The Zeros tried their standard tactics. tried to isolate individual Wildcats, tried to use superior maneuverability, but every time a Zero committed to a Wildcat's tail, that Wildcat turned toward his wingman. Every time the Zeros tried to split a pair, both Wildcats turned toward each other. The pattern held. After 12 minutes, the Zeros broke off. They damaged 2 Wildcats, but scored 0 kills. The Americans had shot down 3 Zeros. 3 confirmed kills. First time in Pacific combat that Wildcats had a positive kill ratio against Zeros in a major engagement. Fighter Command finally took notice. On June 15th, Commander John Thatch received orders to report to Pearl Harbor. Report to Admiral Nimitz. Prepare a formal briefing on the weave tactic. The Navy wanted to evaluate whether this matchstick trick should become official doctrine. Thatch arrived at Pearl Harbor on June 18th, spent 2 days preparing the briefing. Prepared diagrams, combat footage, pilot testimonials, kill ratios, survival statistics, everything command needed to see that the weave worked. But while Thatch was preparing his briefing, Japanese intelligence was preparing something else. They'd analyzed the new American tactics. They'd studied the weave pattern, and they'd developed a counter-tactic, a way to break the weave, a way to kill both Wildcats at once. On June 21st, Thatch would brief Admiral Nimitz on the weave, but on June 23rd, Fighting Squadron 3 would face 18 Zeros over Santa Cruz Island, and those Zeros would be using tactics specifically designed to destroy the Thatch weave. June 23rd, 1942, 08:15 hours, Santa Cruz Island. Fighting Squadron 3 was escorting a convoy when radar picked up contacts, 18 bogies inbound from the northwest, distance 12 miles. Thatch counted his Wildcats, 8 aircraft, 4 pairs, standard weave formation. He'd briefed Nimitz 3 days earlier. Nimitz had authorized field testing of the weave across all Pacific fighter squadrons. Now Thatch was about to discover that the Japanese had done their homework too. The Zeros came in at 16,000 feet, but they didn't dive immediately. They circled, waited. Thatch watched them orbit at altitude for 90 seconds. Strange behavior. Zeros always attacked immediately, always used altitude advantage fast before Americans could climb. But these Zeros were waiting for something. Then Thatch understood. The Zeros were coordinating. 6 Zeros broke left, 6 broke right, 6 stayed high. 3 groups, 3 angles of attack. They'd seen the weave. They knew 2 Wildcats could protect each other from one direction. But 3 directions simultaneously? That was different. The attack came at 08:17. 6 Zeros dove from high. 6 came in from the left flank, 6 from the right. Thatch called the weave, but his pilots hesitated. Which threat do you counter when threats are coming from 3 directions? Lieutenant Bassett chose the high Zeros, turned into them, but that exposed his right flank to the right side group. Ensign Sheedy turned to cover Bassett's right, but that broke the weave pattern with his own wingman. Suddenly all 4 pairs were fragmented, 8 Wildcats fighting independently. Exactly what the Japanese wanted. Thatch saw it happening, saw the weave collapsing. Keyed his radio. Reform pairs! Lock onto your wingmen. Execute standard weave. Ignore the other groups. His pilots heard him. Bassett turned hard toward his wingman, found him, locked in. They executed the weave even with Zeros attacking from multiple directions. The high Zeros dove. Bassett turned toward his wingman. The Zeros followed, flew into his wingman's guns. 2 Zeros exploded. The others pulled up. The left group tried next. Came in at 14,000 feet. Thatch and his wingman executed the weave. 1 Zero committed, flew through the crossing pattern, took 50 caliber rounds through the cockpit, fell away smoking. The right group attacked Sheedy's pair. Same result. Weave held. Zero crashed. After 8 minutes, the Japanese had lost 5 Zeros. The Americans had lost 0 Wildcats. The coordinated 3-direction attack had failed. The Zeros climbed away. But Thatch knew something critical had just happened. The Japanese had adapted. They'd studied the weave. They'd developed counter-tactics. The fact that the counter-tactics failed didn't matter. What mattered was Japanese command was taking the weave seriously. taking it seriously enough to train pilots specifically to defeat it. That evening, Thatch filed a combat report, described the three-direction attack, described how the weave held even under coordinated assault, recommended immediate, widespread adoption. No more testing, no more evaluation. The weave worked against standard tactics. It worked against adapted tactics. It worked, period. The report reached Admiral Nimitz on June 25th. Nimitz forwarded it to Admiral King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet. King read it. Read the kill ratios. Read the survival statistics. 0 American losses. 5 Japanese losses. 8 Wildcats versus 18 Zeros. On June 29th, Admiral King issued Fleet Order 41-1942. All fighter squadrons in the Pacific Fleet would immediately adopt the Thatch Weave as standard combat doctrine. Mandatory training for all pilots, mandatory execution in all engagements. The Matchstick trick was now official U.S. Navy tactics, but orders from Washington took time to reach every squadron, time to train pilots, time to practice the pattern, and the Japanese weren't waiting. On July 7th, over Guadalcanal, 32 Zeros would attack 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons. Some squadrons knew the weave, some didn't, and the ones that didn't would learn the hard way why Thatch had been teaching matches for 5 months. July 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal. 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons flew combat air patrol over Henderson Field. 4 pilots had trained on the Thatch Weave, 8 had not. At 11:20 a.m., 32 Zeros appeared from the north. The 4 pilots who knew the weave immediately paired up, executed the pattern. The 8 who didn't know it fought independently, traditional 1 versus 1 dogfighting. 22 minutes later, 6 Wildcats were shot down. All 6 were pilots who fought independently. The 4 pilots using the weave survived without damage. They claimed 7 zero kills between them. Admiral Halsey read that combat report and immediately issued orders. Every fighter pilot in the South Pacific would learn the Thatch Weave within 2 weeks, no exceptions. Training programs started on July 10th. Thatch flew to Guadalcanal, spent 3 weeks teaching the weave to every squadron on the island. Morning briefings, afternoon flight training, evening debriefs. He showed pilots the matches, drew the diagrams, flew demonstration patterns. Some pilots learned in 2 days, others needed a week, but every pilot learned. By August 1st, 96 Wildcat pilots could execute the weave. By September 1st, 214 pilots. The tactic spread from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from carriers to land bases, from Wildcats to other aircraft types. P-38 Lightning squadrons started using it, P-40 Warhawk squadrons. Even some bomber formations adapted the crossing pattern for defensive purposes. The results were immediate and dramatic. In June 1942, before the weave became doctrine, American fighters had a kill-to-loss ratio of 0.4 to 1 against Zeros. For every 10 American fighters lost, Americans shot down 4 Zeros. By October 1942, after widespread weave adoption, the ratio was 2.1 to 1. Americans were shooting down 2 Zeros for every Wildcat lost. Japanese pilots hated it. Radio intercepts from September showed Japanese squadron commanders warning pilots about the American crossing pattern. Do not commit to tail chase. Do not follow American fighters into their wingman's guns. Disengage if Americans execute coordination tactics. But disengaging meant losing the fight, meant letting American fighters protect their bombers, meant giving up air superiority. The Zero was still faster and more maneuverable than the Wildcat, but speed and maneuverability meant nothing if you couldn't get guns on target, and the Weave made it almost impossible to get guns on target. By January 1943, the Thatch Weave was standard doctrine across all U.S. fighter squadrons. Army Air Force adopted it, Marine Corps adopted it, British Royal Navy pilots started learning it for their carriers. The tactic that started with 2 matches on a desk in San Diego had become the foundation of Allied fighter doctrine. Thatch received the Navy Cross in February 1943. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the development of fighter tactics that have saved numerous American lives and contributed significantly to the success of U.S. naval aviation operations." But Thatch didn't care about medals. He cared about numbers. In the 6 months before the Weave, the Pacific Fleet lost 137 Wildcats in combat with Zeros. In the 6 months after the Weave became doctrine, the fleet lost 41 Wildcats. 96 pilots who came home, because 2 matches could cross paths. Fighter Command assigned Thatch to training duty in March 1943, pulled him from combat operations, sent him back to San Diego to teach the Weave to new pilots. He hated it, hated being away from the fight, but Command told him he was more valuable as an instructor than as a combat pilot. More valuable teaching the trick than using it. Thatch trained pilots for 18 months. Taught the Weave to over 800 naval aviators. Every one of those pilots took the tactic to combat. Every one of them survived situations they shouldn't have survived. And every one of them told other pilots about the commander who saved their lives with matchsticks. The war ended in August 1945. Thatch was 40 years old. He'd flown 73 combat missions, scored 6 confirmed kills, received the Navy Cross, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 3 Air Medals. But none of that compared to the number that mattered. Over 2,000 American pilots survived the war because they knew how to weave. After the war ended, Thatch faced a choice: stay in the Navy or return to civilian life. His wife wanted him home. His children barely knew him. He'd been gone for 4 years. But staying in the Navy meant continuing to teach, continuing to save lives. What would a man who saved 2,000 pilots with matchsticks do when the shooting stopped? John Thatch stayed in the Navy. He couldn't walk away from teaching, couldn't walk away from pilots who needed to survive. He spent the next 27 years training fighter pilots, developing tactics, saving lives without firing a shot. The Navy promoted him to commander in 1946, captain in 1952, rear admiral in 1960. He commanded carrier groups during the Korean War, never flew combat again, but his pilots did. And every one of them knew the Weave. Korean War fighter pilots called it the Thatch Weave, officially. No other tactic in military history carried a pilot's name while he was still alive. During Vietnam, the Weave evolved. F-4 Phantom pilots adapted it for supersonic speeds, called it Fluid 4 formation. Same principle, same crossing pattern, different speeds. American pilots used it against North Vietnamese MiGs. The MiG-17 could outturn the F-4, just like the Zero outturned the Wildcat. But the Weave worked at 600 miles per hour, the same way it worked at 300. Thatch retired from the Navy in 1973. 4-star admiral. 40 years of service. He moved back to San Diego, lived quietly. Didn't talk much about the war. Didn't talk about Midway, or Guadalcanal, or the 2,000 pilots. When reporters asked about the Weave, he always said the same thing. It wasn't genius. It was desperation. I just wanted my boys to come home. Fighter pilots never forgot him. Every year on February 10th, the anniversary of the first Weave combat test, naval aviators from around the country would call Thatch, thank him, tell him stories about how the Weave saved their lives, or their wingman's life. Thatch listened to every story, remembered every name. The Navy named a building after him in 1981, Thatch Hall at Naval Air Station Pensacola, fighter pilot training facility. Every naval aviator who earns their wings walks past a bronze plaque with Thatch's face and 3 words: innovate, adapt, survive. Thatch died on April 15, 2001, 86 years old. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew over 300 naval aviators. Many were in their 70s and 80s, men who'd flown Wildcats in 1943, men who'd flown Phantoms in 1967, men who'd flown Hornets in 1991. All of them alive because one commander thought about matchsticks. Today, the Thatch Weave is still taught at every fighter pilot school in the United States military. Navy, Air Force, Marines. Modern versions adapted for stealth fighters and beyond visual range combat. But the principle never changed. 2 aircraft protecting each other, turning toward each other, crossing paths, surviving together. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola has Thatch's original pack of matches, preserved in a glass case next to a model F4F Wildcat. The label says Lieutenant Commander John Thatch used these matches to develop the tactical innovation that saved over 2,000 American pilots during World War II. School groups walk past that case every day. Most don't stop, but fighter pilots always stop. They look at those matches. They understand. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every week. Stories about pilots and commanders who saved lives with matchsticks and courage. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from Texas, Germany, Australia, Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure John Thatch doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.
In the bitter cold of December 1939, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels sat down to record something that should have been impossible. In his diary, he wrote words that seemed almost absurd for a nation that had conquered much of Europe and controlled vast coal fields across the continent. The coal situation in Berlin, he noted, was approaching catastrophic proportions. People were going without heat, factories were slowing. And all of this while Germany produced more coal than nearly any other nation on Earth. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known at that moment, was that this paradox would haunt the Nazi regime for the rest of the war, becoming one of the most revealing failures of their entire system. Here was a nation that sat atop a coal empire spanning from the Ruhr Valley to the Polish territories and Czechoslovak mines. Yet within months of the war's beginning, Germany faced a shortage that would only deepen as the years passed. The story is not one of running out. It is the story of something far more revealing about how war actually works. Most people assume that Germany's coal problem came from invasion and bombing, from enemy destruction of the mines themselves. This narrative is incomplete. It obscures a more fundamental reality. Germany had begun suffering from serious coal shortages as early as 1937, more than 2 years before World War II even began. The nation possessed coal of exceptional quality, among the finest in all of Europe. German miners, working in among the most mechanized mines on the continent, produced coal at rates that surpassed Great Britain by 1/3 and were double those of France and Belgium. In 1938 and 1939, Germany produced 187.5 million tons of hard coal. This was not a production problem. Germany's miners were among the most efficient in the world. But something more systemic was broken, and it revealed itself precisely at the moment when the German war machine needed coal most desperately. To understand how Germany found itself freezing and without sufficient coal while controlling coalfields across half of Europe, we must go back to the mid-1930s, to a moment when the regime made choices that would undermine everything that came after. At that moment, Germany controlled its own domestic coal production. The Ruhr Valley, that vast industrial heartland on Germany's western border, produced enormous quantities of coal. Upper Silesia, captured after World War I and then lost at Versailles before being regained through aggression, held vast reserves. Yet even with these resources, Germany faced a problem that no amount of conquest could solve. It was not a mining problem. It was a movement problem. In 1933, when Hitler seized power, the Deutsche Reichsbahn was already struggling. This was not a system built for war. It was a system built to earn money and pay German reparations. The Weimar Republic had taken control of thousands of kilometers of track, unified the old state railway systems, and in 1924, under the Dawes Plan, the Reichsbahn was organized as a nominally private company required to pay hundreds of millions of marks in annual reparations. This meant the railway was starved of capital, maintenance was deferred, infrastructure was neglected. By 1933, the system was aging, exhausted, barely adequate for peacetime. But then something worse happened. Hitler's new regime, eager to reward loyal Nazis and desperate to control key institutions, did something that seemed logical at the time, but proved catastrophic in consequences. The Nazis took control of the Reichsbahn and filled it with party members. Trained railway administrators were dismissed or arrested. Competent engineers were replaced with ardent Nazis who understood party ideology but knew nothing of railway logistics. The regime slashed modernization spending, diverting resources instead to rearmament. The railways were not equipped for war. They were not even adequately maintained in peacetime. And then the regime reduced fares to please the public, which only increased demand while the system's capacity remained frozen in time. By the time of the Munich crisis in 1938, just a year before the war would begin, the Reichsbahn was approaching collapse. And this collapse would have nothing to do with enemy action. It was created by neglect and ideology. The consequence would reshape the entire war. Coal had to be moved from the mines to the factories, to the power stations, to the cities where people needed heat. Coal is heavy. 1 ton of coal cannot be carried by truck effectively. It requires trains. It requires hundreds of thousands of freight wagons. It requires locomotives. It requires a railway system prepared to handle the immense tonnage needed by a modern economy preparing for war. Germany, by 1937, was already suffering from coal shortages, even in peacetime. Not because the mines were empty, because the coal was sitting in the mines, or in warehouses, unable to reach where it was needed. Goebbels complained about it repeatedly in his diary. The coal situation was becoming acute. These were not temporary disruptions. This was a structural crisis in the nation's ability to distribute what it produced. And Germany would go to war with this system already stretched to breaking point. But the war changed everything. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Almost immediately, the demands on the Reichsbahn escalated beyond anything it had been prepared for. Troop movements replaced civilian traffic. Military supplies took priority over commercial goods. The system, already inadequate, now had to support both a nation trying to keep its economy running and an army requiring massive quantities of coal, oil, ammunition, food, and replacement vehicles. And something else changed too. Germany conquered new territories. It conquered Czech coalfields. It conquered Polish coalfields. These were not minor additions. The coal-rich regions of Czechoslovakia and Poland, particularly the Upper Silesian Basin with its massive reserves, gave Germany access to hundreds of thousands of additional tons of coal annually. By 1944, at the peak of German coal production, Germany was producing 268.9 million tons of hard coal per year. This was a staggering figure. Germany had never produced so much coal in its history. Yet by 1940, just 1 year into the war, the coal shortage had become critical. How was this possible? What happened? The answer reveals the true nature of Germany's problem and the mechanical reality of modern warfare. When Germany conquered territory, it inherited not just mines, but also people. Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, France, and a dozen other nations under German control or German influence no longer had access to their traditional coal suppliers. Before the war, much of occupied Europe had imported coal from one place above all others: Wales. British coal had flowed across the Channel to supply the continental economy. Now that Germany controlled those territories, Germany had a choice. Let the occupied economies collapse, which would be economically counterproductive and politically dangerous, or replace the British coal by exporting German coal to these territories. Germany chose to keep the occupied territories economically productive. This meant Germany had to use a significant portion of its own coal to replace what the occupied nations could no longer import from Britain. Germany's ability to supply its own needs was reduced by its conquest of others. But there was something more. Germany's conquered coal also required transportation. The Polish coal mines were far from Germany. The Czech coal was considerable but still had to be moved. And the tools available to move coal had not expanded proportionally. The Reichsbahn was still the same inadequate system. It still had roughly the same number of locomotives and freight wagons. It still relied on tracks that had not been significantly upgraded. Germany's conquest of coal-rich territory actually increased the transportation burden, because now coal had to move not just within Germany but across longer distances, from the periphery of the German-dominated zone to the industrial heartland. And then came June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union would transform Germany's coal crisis into a catastrophe from which it never recovered. On that day, approximately 3.8 million German troops, augmented by nearly 1 million soldiers from Romania, Finland, Hungary, and Italy, totaling over 4 million men of the Axis powers, began one of the largest military invasions in human history. They streamed across a front stretching 1,800 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. They required supplies. They required food. They required ammunition. They required fuel. They required coal for the trains that had to supply them. And the Reichsbahn, that already exhausted system, was now asked to support something it had never been designed for. Each major German army group required approximately 75 trains per day just to function. The demands escalated dramatically. By August 1942, during the build-up for the assault on Stalingrad, the German transport system was moving more than 3,000 trains per month just for the Southern Army Group. These trains had to carry ammunition, rations, fuel, supplies, and troops. They had to cross into occupied territory, distribute supplies across enormous distances, and somehow still find capacity to move coal from German and captured mines westward toward the industrial regions that needed it. The mathematics of this became impossible, but there was something more. The Soviet railway system used a different gauge than the German system. When German forces advanced into Soviet territory, their trains simply could not use the captured Soviet tracks without massive conversion work. Soldiers and engineers had to convert thousands of kilometers of Soviet broad-gauge lines to German standard gauge, a process that consumed enormous amounts of material, labor, and time. The railway infrastructure that should have helped the German advance actually became an additional burden, requiring resources to rebuild and convert rather than resources available to move supplies forward. What happened in the winter of 1941 and into 1942 revealed the true nature of Germany's coal crisis. Historians often describe a coal shortage during this period. This is technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. There was no shortage of coal. Coal existed. Coal was being mined. Germany produced enormous quantities. But there was a catastrophic shortage of coal wagons. The Wehrmacht had appropriated coal transport wagons for military use. Units moving to the front had hijacked freight cars. Wagons were commandeered for supplies and never returned. As these wagons reached the chaotic railheads behind the front line, many were simply tipped off the tracks to make room for following trains. They were abandoned. Wagons that had been sent eastward disappeared into the vast space of Russia, never returning to Germany, lost at rates that matched the enormous vehicle and horse casualties of the campaign itself. In the winter of 1941 going into 1942, Berlin was desperately cold. Civilian accounts and the regime's official records documented that coal was extremely difficult to obtain. People were going without heat. Restaurants were crowded and expensive because they offered warmth as much as sustenance. Families in cities and towns across the Reich faced rationing on heating coal. Yet Germany had conquered what it believed would be sufficient coal resources. The problem was distribution. The problem was the Reichsbahn. The problem was a system that had been starved of resources, infiltrated by political appointees, and never designed for the demands of total war. The crisis became so severe that in May 1942, Julius Dorpmüller, the general director of the Reichsbahn, went to Hitler himself with a stark message. He could no longer guarantee the railway would be able to handle the traffic the regime was demanding. It was a moment of brutal honesty in a system that usually rewarded only optimistic predictions. Hitler's response was to bring in two men to solve the crisis. Albert Speer, the Minister for Armaments and Munitions Production, and Erhard Milch, the Director of Air Armament, took direct control of the railway situation. They were given authority to make decisions that normally would have required committee approval. They implemented their changes with what historical records describe as brutal efficiency. They removed people they judged incompetent or ideologically unreliable. They streamlined operations. They cancelled civilian services where possible. They prioritized military transport. What Speer and Milch did was important, but it could only address the symptoms, not the underlying disease. They ordered the construction of new locomotives. In 1943 alone, German factories built over 4,500 locomotives and nearly 52,000 freight wagons. This was a staggering production effort, yet it was not enough. The losses of wagons in Russia, the increasing demands of warfare on multiple fronts, and the fundamental inadequacy of infrastructure meant that no amount of new construction could restore the system to what it needed to be. Each wagon built in 1943 had to replace losses from 1942 and support increased traffic demands. The system could never catch up. Even these extraordinary production efforts came from somewhere. Building locomotives required steel that could have gone to tank production, steel that could have gone to armor plating, steel that could have gone to weapons. This was the true cost of Germany's coal crisis. It was not just that coal failed to move, it was that trying to fix the transportation system consumed resources that otherwise would have gone to military production. Germany was forced to choose between building the weapons of war and building the wagons to supply the weapons already built, and this problem only intensified as the war continued. By the time Allied bombing began to seriously damage the German coal industry in 1944, the system was already broken for other reasons. Yes, bombs destroyed mines. Yes, bombs damaged refineries that converted coal into synthetic oil. Yes, bombs destroyed rail lines. But the fundamental crisis had begun years earlier, rooted in decisions made in the early 1930s, compounded by the conquest of territory that required more coal to supply than it produced, and then catastrophically worsened by the demands of Operation Barbarossa on a system that could not possibly support it. What made this crisis particularly revealing was that it demonstrated something about the nature of modern industrial warfare that the Nazis had not adequately understood. You cannot simply conquer an economy and add it to your own. When Germany conquered France, it did not simply gain French industrial capacity. It gained the responsibility to keep the French population fed, to keep French industry functioning, to prevent the French economy from collapsing, which would create unrest, resistance, and instability. This required resources. The same was true of every occupied territory. Germany conquered territories that had previously traded coal to and from other nations, territories that were integrated into international supply networks. Germany broke those networks. Germany then had to replace them entirely from its own production. This was economically unsustainable. There was another revelation in the coal crisis, one that historians would later recognize as crucial to understanding Germany's defeat. Transportation logistics, the unglamorous task of moving supplies, proved more important to winning the war than possession of resources. Germany could possess coal. Germany could possess minerals. Germany could possess factories. But if the coal could not reach the factories efficiently, if supplies could not reach the armies efficiently, if raw materials could not be gathered, processed, and distributed through a functioning system, all the resources in the world were meaningless. The Nazis, a regime built on grand gestures, spectacular victories, and rapid conquest, had neglected the boring infrastructure of logistics, and this neglect would prove fatal. By 1943, the problems were compounding. Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Force had begun systematic attacks on Germany's synthetic fuel plants. Germany had invested heavily in technology to convert coal into liquid petroleum. Friedrich Bergius had pioneered coal hydrogenation in the 1920s. Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute had developed their own coal conversion process. By 1945, Germany had constructed 12 coal hydrogenation plants and 9 Fischer-Tropsch plants. These were technological achievements, but they were also voracious consumers of coal. At precisely the moment when Germany needed every ton of coal for industry and heating and railway locomotives, a significant portion was being diverted to create synthetic fuel. This too was a choice, made in the late 1930s, that allocated coal to synthetic fuel production when that coal could have gone directly to the weapons industry. When the Allies bombed these synthetic fuel plants, the crisis deepened another layer. Some of the plants could not be repaired quickly because the transportation system could not bring coal to them efficiently. Coal was stockpiling at railheads. Coal was sitting in storage, but the wagons to move it, the locomotives to pull it, the infrastructure to distribute it, all of this remained inadequate. So plants sat idle, not because coal was unavailable, but because they could not receive it. This intersection of bombing, transportation crisis, and synthetic fuel production created a descending spiral from which Germany never escaped. The human costs of this crisis were substantial and largely invisible. Miners in the coal fields worked under increasingly harsh conditions. As German workers were conscripted into the military, foreign workers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp prisoners were forced into the mines. Working conditions deteriorated. Accident rates increased. Production actually rose despite this, a testament to increased pressure on the workforce, but it came at enormous human cost. In the Ruhr Valley, one of the key mining regions, miners faced demands to extract more coal while equipment was neglected, safety standards collapsed, and the conditions of work worsened. By 1944, the German mining industry was depending on coerced labor on an enormous scale. From a different perspective, the civilians of Germany and the occupied territories experienced the coal crisis directly. In cities and towns across the Reich, heating coal was rationed. Families went cold in winter. Electricity was restricted. Factories shut down operations on certain days. Food production declined because agricultural machinery could not operate. The entire civilian economy was constrained by the inability to move coal effectively. Germany had defeated most of continental Europe militarily. Germany controlled more territory than the German Empire had at any point in its history. Yet, by 1942, German civilians were experiencing shortages that previous generations would have found unthinkable during a time of such military dominance. What the coal crisis revealed about the Soviet perspective was equally important. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had centralized control of its entire transportation system. When the Nazis invaded, the Soviets reorganized their railway network under unified command. They created clear chains of authority. They allowed railway professionals to do their jobs without constant interference from military commanders. The Soviet General Staff understood that railways had to be managed as a unified network, that transport capacity had to be allocated by a central authority, that the needs of supply had to be given equal weight to the needs of firepower. Germany, even under Speer's reforms, never achieved this level of coordination. The rivalry between different military branches, between industry and the military, between the Reich's various overlapping authorities, meant that the railway system was never fully optimized. Competing demands from the Luftwaffe, the Navy, the Army, and the economy meant resources were always being pulled in different directions. The broader significance of Germany's coal crisis extended far beyond the shortage itself. It demonstrated that modern industrial warfare was won not by conquest, not by strategy, and not by superior weapons alone. It was won by the unglamorous details of moving coal and ammunition and food and fuel to where they were needed when they were needed. Germany had focused on tactics and strategy and weapons development. Germany had neglected logistics, and this neglect would contribute significantly to Germany's eventual defeat. By the final years of the war, as the Soviet Union pressed westward and the Anglo-American forces pressed eastward, the German military increasingly found itself unable to function, not because soldiers were unwilling to fight, but because there was no ammunition to fire, no fuel to move vehicles, no coal to power the factories that might have produced more ammunition and fuel. The coal shortage of 1939 and 1940 that seemed impossible at the time, a nation with vast coal resources facing heating crises, was the visible manifestation of this deeper systemic problem. Germany had abundance, but not access. Germany had resources, but not distribution. Germany had conquered an empire, but could not manage it. The trains simply could not keep up. And when the trains fail in a modern industrial economy waging total war, everything else fails with them. In this sense, the coal that Goebbels was frantic about in December 1939 was more strategically important than any weapon, any territorial conquest, any military victory. It was the coal that could not move that would ultimately help defeat Germany far more effectively than any enemy bomb or any opposing army. It was a lesson that Hitler's regime learned only too late, and a lesson that would reshape military strategy and logistics planning for every major power that followed. A recognition that in modern warfare, the quartermaster matters more than the general.